On the 21st of April 1945, the first Soviet troops entered Berlin, Nazi Germany's last stand in World War II. The official story of Germany's liberation, told both by the American and Soviet sides, claims that their soldiers came to free the oppressed German people from Hitler's evil hands. For that reason, German citizens welcomed the foreign soldiers with open arms, glad for the arrival of freedom. Little is said about the darker side of Germany's Allied invasion. One of the most scandalous and shocking realities of Germany's invasion has to do with the treatment of German women by their supposed liberators. Red Army troops and American soldiers stormed the country, crushed the resistance, and unleashed their deviant desires on the most vulnerable population, women and little girls. With nothing to stop them except their own individual moral compasses, this is the story of the abhorrent fate of the German women after the fall of the Third Reich. Welcome to the Marshall Memoirs. Hell in Berlin, the Soviets between revenge and lust. By the time combat broke in the streets of Berlin in April 1945, an estimated 1.5 million women and girls lived in the city. Many had lost their homes to the ceaseless bombing of Soviet mortar and their husbands to the battlefront. There was food and water shortage, and basic services were all but cut. To add to their suffering, experts have calculated that 1 in 3 of these women suffered some kind of sexual assault at the end of the World War II. Many of them met the perpetrators face-to-face during the week of April 24th to May 5th, 1945, when the Soviets surrounded the city of Berlin, killing the last traces of a Nazi resistance. Only a few days before the iconic photograph of the Soviet flag flying atop the Reichstag was taken, many women suffered at the hands of these so-called heroes. The Battle of Berlin was bloody and cruel, not only because it really was the last stand of the Nazis who had nothing more to lose, but also because it consisted mostly of close-quarter combat and the fighting troops were severely unprepared. These were not the elite troops of the Waffen-SS. The defense of Berlin was left to General Helmuth Weidling's mostly depleted and disorganized reserve division. Moreover, General Weidling's garrison consisted almost entirely of elderly men of the national militia and kids from the Hitler Youth, including little girls with no fighting experience. They had to fight starved and vicious Soviet troops who were eager to finally end hostilities. The official casualties of the Battle of Berlin were more than 900,000 Germans and 360,000 Polish and Soviet. The number of abused women varies according to the source, going from 20,000 to 100,000 up to almost 1 million. However, the actual number may be considerably higher, since many women were assaulted not once but repeatedly. It is said that as many as 10,000 women died as a result of these horrific attacks. Moving away from Berlin, almost 2 million German women were victims of the unbridled sexual and violent appetites of the Red Army soldiers. A shocking figure, since it is the equivalent of the population of a metropolis. And this is without counting those who were victims on the Western Front in the hands of American soldiers. Throughout Operation Barbarossa and the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler had ordered his soldiers to liquidate all so-called Bolsheviks and anyone who could be considered their allies or accomplices. For the Wehrmacht, the order was clear. All Slavic peoples had to be eliminated. The war waged by Germany against the Soviet Union was a war of extermination, quite contrary to how they acted on the Western Front and the treatment of the French. Moreover, the Germans were ordered by Hitler to scorch earth on their retreat. With these orders, the Nazi soldiers massacred entire villages and destroyed towns. They left only death and destruction in their wake. These terrible genocidal actions on the part of Hitler's soldiers stuck in the collective imagination of Soviet soldiers. In fact, it did not take much propaganda on the part of Stalin to demonize the Germans. Many of these Russians who took Berlin were themselves victims, their homes destroyed, their mothers, brothers, and sisters massacred. The Soviet people undoubtedly bore the brunt of the war. There were more than 27 million people killed. With all this accumulated resentment and hatred for the Germans, Soviet youth answered Stalin's call to arms to push through East Prussia toward Berlin in what can only be described as a truly destructive passion. Encouraged by the large caches of alcoholic beverages conveniently left behind by the retreating Germans, Red Army volunteers and soldiers bravely carried through the Russian winter. These young soldiers were also joined by the Soviet prisoners of war they freed along the way. Once in Berlin, they faced a resistance carried out by inexperienced young and old German common people, as well as regular soldiers. Joseph Goebbels had ordered the Berlin inhabitants that they must build a fierce defense street by street, house by house, to repel the big Russian beast or die trying, and many died fighting until their last breath. Berlin women's daily struggle: assaults, venereal diseases, and abortions. During those first months of the Allied occupation of Berlin, it is reported that the sexual assault of women of all ages had become routine. It had been naturalized by victims, perpetrators, authorities, and witnesses alike. Nobody did anything about it. Nobody reacted against the abuses that took place in a society stunned by destruction, death, and continuous bombings. German women and girls were simply left adrift, abandoned to their own fate and the desires of the men in uniform. This type of crime was just one in a series of horrible humiliations that came with war and defeat. These women had lost their homes, seeing the walls fall on their loved ones. They had become refugees and found themselves suddenly unable to bring their children a loaf of bread. They saw their husbands killed, maimed, or taken prisoner. Those women also had to see how their children got sick and died, how their parents also died of some disease, how their children started to suffer from malnutrition. The daily sexual assault then was just one more chapter in this daily hell. Stories of sexual violence were told as just a normal aftermath of defeat. Many men and women even justified these actions and even told themselves that they deserved it. Women, girls, and even elderly women were brutally attacked in groups and in public. Often there was a line of soldiers waiting for their turn. They were considered nothing more than a piece of meat, barely an object of desire. Truly shocking stories have survived from those times in the streets of Berlin. Soldiers full of lust and desire for revenge not only attacked them sexually, but also mutilated them, leaving their personal mark on what they considered to be the enemy. There are cases of women being shot to death right after being brutally attacked. There were reports of women's bodies found lying on the streets, as if they had been victims of Jack the Ripper, with their bodies cut open from the stomach to the anus. All this unjustifiable horror is also part of Berlin's liberation history. Needless to say, the assaults always happened without any regard for the victim, not even the common decency of protecting them against venereal diseases or unwanted pregnancies. This way, women were used and tossed aside a minute after, with permanent consequences to their health and lives. Some were forced to bury their own small children, only to become pregnant days later with the offspring of an unknown soldier they would never see again. Millions of German women were faced with the harrowing choice between having these children or incurring in risky operations. Abortions and venereal diseases resulting from sexual aggression became a public issue because they had social and health consequences and required medical intervention. In the context of the war and the foreign occupation, the Nazi authorities and later the Allied forces understood that it was a social and medical problem that needed to be solved. That is the reason why women at these locations received free medical treatment and abortions. After May 1945 and throughout most of 1946, a medical commission was set up in Berlin to approve or reject abortions. Those which were approved could be performed even in the last month of pregnancy. In most cases, the only condition was that the women had to certify that they had been assaulted by a foreigner who could be a Red Army soldier, an American, a French soldier, or a worker from an occupying force. The medical commission that was formed especially for these cases prepared reports on the identity of each woman who underwent the abortion, recording her name, marital status, address, month of pregnancy, date of request, and date of approval by the medical commission. In other words, records were kept of all the women who requested abortions, which in many cases implied an additional stigma. Many women who wanted to remain anonymous underwent similar procedures privately. It has been estimated that about 2 million women had abortions each year between 1945 and 1948, mostly in the Soviet zone. A private abortion cost around 1,000 marks and was performed without anesthesia. 6,000 Berlin women died each year in the Soviet zone from resulting complications. It should be noted that the practice of abortion was not legalized in the occupied zones of Germany, but the local and foreign authorities, as well as the Protestant Church itself, gave their consent to the practice. The only political and social actor that fervently opposed it was the Catholic Church. Women's desperate pledge for choice over their bodies. Due to the Nazis' effort to raise the birth rate of the Third Reich, thus spawning more healthy Aryan children, abortion was heavily punished during most of the time. During World War II, however, abortion policy in Nazi Germany varied depending on the people group and territory the policy was directed at. The commonality between policies was its purpose in promoting the birth rate and population of the Aryan race and minimizing the population of others such as Slavs, and those deemed a burden on German society such as the children of disabled and mentally ill persons. Forced abortions of migrant workers, for instance, was referenced in documents from the trials of war criminals before the Nuremberg military tribunals. It has been categorized as a part of Nazi Germany's systematic program of genocide, aimed at the destruction of foreign nations and ethnic groups. In Poland, for example, abortion was forbidden until 1939, when the Nazis invaded the country. Now the prohibition was not only removed, but encouraged in those cases when the child did not have a German father. As it is obvious from these facts, abortion policy for Hitler was not a matter of ethics, but of politics. Vestiges of a Germany that believed itself to be racially superior to its opponents survived in the years immediately after the end of World War II. One of them is found in the creation of special medical wards for abortions that were justified on the grounds of not mixing with Slavs, or so-called Mongols. Mongol was a very common and derogatory term used to describe some Soviet soldiers coming from the Asian part of the country. The Allies attached medical commissions composed of 3 to 4 physicians to the gynecology wards of every Berlin hospital. At the head of the medical commission, the Allies appointed a physician of recognized anti-fascist trajectory, but that according to some observers and workers of the commission, there were also some surgeons and health workers who had actively participated in Nazism and who were now entrusted with this task. This was obviously due to the general lack of trustworthy physicians, but it is still spine-chilling to think that the same doctors who were now preventing unwanted pregnancies had been practicing forceful sterilizations and euthanasia only months before. As stated before, there were also some girls or women of lower class who, trying to avoid the shame of being listed as women who had abortions, went to a healer to have an abortion. After a generally unsuccessful experience, many would arrive to the gynecology wards with injuries or illnesses contracted during the process. Although an attempt was made to perform a safe abortion, many unfortunately died in the process. There are no reliable statistics, but the number of deaths due to malpractice must have been very high. In order to request the abortion, the women often resorted to Nazi racial hygiene discourse that prohibited mixed descent. Often, they even lied and claimed that they had been attacked by Afro-descendants or Asians. Thus, female assault victims could not escape the stereotypes created by Hitler's Nazi propaganda. The descriptions of the assailants were most of the times very cartoony, full of stereotypes and prejudice. For instance, it was commonly claimed in letter addressed to the medical commissions that the attackers were of Asian or Mongol race, but also that they were malformed, had visible body deformities, or slow-witted. This speaks of the desperation of these women, who exaggerate the characteristics just so that their requests would not be denied. Anne-Marie Durand-Weber was one of the few anti-fascist doctors operating in Berlin, and after the arrival of the Soviets, she continued to work in a first aid station. In this way, she tried to heal the sick, the injured, the mutilated, and the victims of abuse. She was one of the first to test women and girls for venereal diseases. Durand-Weber described in her diary how she sadly had to assist her own daughter, who was reportedly attacked by 4 Russians at the same time. An untiring pro-choice activist, she co-founded in 1952 an organization called German Society for Family Planning and Sex Education and Counseling, destined to help young girls to make educated choices about their bodies. The difficult task of surviving as a woman in war-torn Berlin. But within the general situation of war and occupation, being victims of violence and sexual assault was barely one in many daily struggles women faced. The relentless propaganda machine created by Joseph Goebbels and Adolf Hitler had also pushed them to become the only caregivers in their households. They were expected to take care of the family while their husbands were on the front lines, especially when their parents were killed. Left alone to take care of the children, Women led the barter market for food and shelter, which were scarce in the aftermath of the Battle of Berlin. Another important detail is that they often negotiated the protection of their children and themselves with the occupying soldiers. These negotiations were made in uneven circumstances, and the other party often took advantage of these women's vulnerability. Thus, in return of protection, they would usually have to give out provision of food, shelter, secrecy, but also other types of experiences such as sexual favors, prostitution, or accept daily abuse. Soviet and American profiteers sometimes rented these women out to their comrades, charging them money to have sexual encounters with their protected ladies. Many women, as well as a large part of the German people, were at first relieved by the arrival of the so-called liberators. These foreign soldiers were coming to liberate all the people from the oppressive and opprobrious regime that had led them to the worst moment of their lives, plunging the whole society into a suicidal war. However, many of them, millions even, ended up very disappointed when they fell victims of their supposed liberators. One of the most notorious cases was that of Inga Deutschkron. Born in 1922 to a Jewish family in Brandenburg, she spent her early years in hiding from the Nazis with her mother. In 1945, she was 23 years old. In her memories, Inga recalls her great joy and relief when she heard the roar of the Soviet tanks coming up the road approaching her Berlin hideout. It was the announcement of the end of the regime that forced her and her mother to live in the shadows, permanently worried about being caught and killed or worse. She felt the tanks were the end of this long nightmare under the shadow of the Nazis. A new, more egalitarian and freer world loomed in her thoughts. Now she would be able to fulfill her lifelong dreams and maybe even meet the love of her life in one of those soldiers who came to liberate her. But it all turned into a new nightmare soon. One day, Inga ran into one of these soldiers who were going to free her. She greeted him with a smile, but he grabbed her by her clothes, trying to undress her. At first, not quite understanding what was happening, Inga ran to her mother. Her mother was completely disappointed in the soldier and began to suspect that everything she had heard about the occupying army was true. But she still had some hope. She told Inga to go get her Jewish identity card that had been hidden in the goat shed. Surely when they saw they were Jewish people in hiding, they would understand their struggle and protect them. But the soldiers did not even bother to read her papers. They were more interested in the young girl's bodily features, not caring that she was dirty and heavily malnourished. Inga relates how she was chased around the streets by these lusty soldiers who turned her into a sex object. She could not run far. She did not have the strength. Losing hope, she returned to the cellar she called home. Later that day, when Inga is found in an empty house on a bed, more Russians assault and abuse her, although by this time she claims to have felt nothing. She even reports that the soldiers bit her, but she just let it happen, and then they left her alone. Stories like this one replicated in most quarters of Berlin in 1945, and most of them are lost to time. American soldiers, even worse than the Russians. By now we have established that many, if not most, Red Army soldiers who marched into Berlin on May 1945 behaved in a less than gentlemanly way. Attacks on local women were as vicious and heartless as those on the enemy military. This begs the question, did the American soldiers conduct themselves differently? Looking back on the history of the 20th century, we know that Americans and Russians would be great rivals for the following half-century. For close to 50 years, they would try to show the world how wicked the Russians were compared to the reasonable, industrious Americans. They portrayed themselves as the morally superior side, so the answer to the question of whether they treated German women better should be affirmative. However, there are reasons to believe this was not the case. Unfortunately, to this day we do not have reliable statistics to give us a guideline of the number of German women who were victims of the American soldiers as we do the number of women who were victims of the communists. But hundreds of horrific testimonies and life stories tell the real story of the Allied occupation of Germany. The real story, however, clashes with the perspective of millions of Americans and people all over the world. Their version was spread in advertisements, propaganda, movies, and schools in the West. Many cartoons and photographs of that time showed American soldiers as heroes being hugged and kissed by the women of the liberated countries. They were pictured handing out chocolates to the children, and men and women celebrating in equality the end of the war all over the world. However, this ideal portrait was far from the truth. For most American soldiers, Germany was their first time in an Axis country. They no longer felt compelled to respect private property, as they did in occupied countries like Holland, Luxembourg, and Belgium, and relished the opportunity to make Germans suffer the same discomforts they had endured for years. 5 years of war propaganda had inspired a profound hatred for everything German, including their people. They were little more than vermin, and as such, they should be treated. In France, Americans had arrived as liberators. In Germany, they were more akin to conquerors. In France, American soldiers felt like guests, and even though they had had to shoot their way into the country, they still took their hosts' feelings and customs into account. German sensibilities, on the other hand, were of no importance, and in no way was this more evident than in the manner in which soldiers treated the German population. For the Americans, the conquest of women served two purposes. First, they were trophies for the American soldiers against their Nazi rivals. On the other hand, it was part of the culture war, a form of propaganda to show that in their power struggle they had not only defeated them militarily and politically, but had also taken their women. The American soldiers began criminal actions against the civilian population as soon as they landed in Normandy. There was fighting, looting, and destruction. French women were the first victims of these soldiers who supposedly came to liberate them from the Nazi yoke. All this action was accompanied by an American propaganda apparatus aimed at encouraging and sexualizing their soldiers. A whole myth was created of the brave, virile soldier who had the right to take possession of the best European women. A whole system of propaganda about France and the sexual practices of its women had also been built up for years, something that fed the dark fantasies of the North American soldiers. All these ideas and actions were taken across the Rhine and were amplified in Germany. It was undoubtedly an invasion of male lust and impunity. The American political and military authorities were as complicit in this action as the Soviet ones, and perhaps even worse. In order to put an end to a mainly homoerotic climate within the army, sexual promiscuity among its men was even accepted. Those were times when it was believed that chastity could lead to homosexuality, so sexually attacking a woman was a lesser evil for the values of those American authorities. The American dream turns into a women's nightmare. German women were also victims of this propaganda system. Although the Nazi regime was quite hermetic, the ideology behind the American dream managed to leak into their ears. Many German women were fascinated by the relative prosperity in which the American soldiers were supposedly living. Americans were living through the New Deal years of incredible economic recovery while they were suffering the hardships of the Versailles Treaty and later the war. There was widespread hope about the possibility that these women could meet a brave, courageous, and protective American soldier on the battlefield, cure him, take him home, and become the mother of his children. Obviously, in return, the soldier would invite them to live the American dream on the other side of the ocean. Thus it was that many women fell prey to these individuals, and rather than living the American dream, fell into the American nightmare. But it was not only German women who felt they could finally achieve the dream of living a prosperous life in the New World. Black soldiers in the US Army also saw this situation as an opportunity. In those years in the United States, they could not marry white women and suffered many other forms of discrimination and segregation. These were the years leading up to the 1960s and the explosion of the Black Civil Rights Movement. For US authorities, African American soldiers had the right to fight alongside a white soldier, but not to ride the same bus or marry a white woman. The dream of having a relationship with a white woman was tempting for many Black Americans, and it was also believed that marrying a white woman was synonymous with greater prosperity. They also believed the rumors that German women were not as prudish about their sex life and morality as white American women supposedly were. A quite sad case involving a German woman attacked by the occupying forces occurred in the outskirts of Munich. It was not long after the end of the war in 1946. That day, a fruit and vegetable vendor who was attacked by 2 American soldiers. She was walking alone when a military van stopped in front of her. One of the soldiers pointed a rifle at her and ordered her to go with him. She refused. He insisted, and they struggled in the street. There was no one to help her, and the other GI did nothing either. Under his watch, the first man overpowered the woman and forced himself into her. After he finished having non-consensual sex with her, He seemed to look remorseful and asked her to please refrain from reporting the incident. But the ordeal was not over for her. The other soldier threatened to shoot her and forced her to go into the trees with him. After this double attack, the soldiers were quickly on their way. The first soldier, who had shown remorse, asked her politely if they could see each other again, to which she agreed. They gave her 2 cigarettes and a piece of chocolate and drove off in the direction of Greifeling, a nearby town. This outrageous case shows how omnipotent the American soldiers believed themselves to be during their stay in Germany. They had no scruples about attacking a woman in broad daylight and even tried to bribe her and buy her silence with a handout. There was a tacit agreement of complicit silence in the face of this type of action on the part of both the German and American authorities, while the women continued to be victims of this type of action. Another terrible case was that of a 15-year-old girl from Würzburg. Many years later, she still could not testify without bursting into tears about what had happened to her. She could not put into words what she had experienced. She had been attacked by no less than 8 American soldiers. After the hours-long medical examination to determine whether or not she had been abused, she and her defense felt that her rights had been violated. Again, even 10 years after the fact, justice was still more on the side of the perpetrator than the victim. Post-war impunity and cowardice. One of the main reasons the victors acted the way they did is that they usually did not face any consequences. Even when women did muster the courage to denounce the attackers, real trials and sentences rarely happened. The justice often claimed that members of the US armed forces should be tried by the military and not by the civilian justice system. And military courts tend to be lenient towards their own members. It did not help the process the fact that most of the times American defendants questioned the women's credibility. The tactic of accusing sexual assault victims of lying was all too common, as it was often claimed that these women wanted to earn money out of making false accusations. Even years after the war ended, the attacks continued. In the last 3 months of 1952 alone, the Bavarian Minister of the Interior received 227 reports of serious incidents involving American soldiers. Of the 227 reported, 18 were nothing less than attempted sexual assaults. In the last 3 months of 1953, this number of reports even increased to 260. These facts made the Bavarian society worried and afraid of being attacked by American soldiers. The figure of the liberating hero was now a thing of the past. Everything seemed to indicate that the protective power that the Americans deployed with funds and security, through the Marshall Plan among other initiatives, was accompanied by a very dark B-side that included a naturalization of the sexual assault on women, perhaps as a sign of the exercise of power for victory. Not only the defense attorneys and the victims themselves complained about the leniency with which American defendants were treated by both German and American military justice in cases of sexual assault convictions. These allegations were also frequent in the local press. In one case in particular, the attack on a 12-year-old girl in 1959, the perpetrators were immediately released, and this led to public outrage throughout Bavaria, which resulted in protests. Faced with the public demonstrations, the parliament and some religious leaders questioned the Ministry of Foreign Affairs about its actions in this case and the fact that it had not raised any complaints against the United States. They demanded that once and for all, the occupying forces leave German women and girls alone in a context of increasing sexual violence that persisted after the end of the war and was repeated again and again each time a military base was set up on German territory. Another example of this type of violence against women occurred in 1963 in the city of Gelnhausen in Hesse. This was almost 2 whole decades since the end of hostilities in 1945. The 3rd U.S. Tank Division was stationed there. Since the installation of the foreign forces, numerous house robberies, vandalism, and street violence began to be registered, which aroused the indignation of the local population and the distrust and hatred towards the American soldiers. Among the crimes reported, there were many instances of sexual assault against local women. The daily nightmare experienced by German women in the hands of American soldiers could sometimes become even more perverse and traumatic when their own feelings were mixed and confused, as they were frequently also victims of sentimental manipulation on the part of their victimizers. Some women were forced to have solitary sexual relations with only one soldier, as if they were in an exclusive relationship. However, they had no choice over this relationship, as it resembled more an abduction than a real romantic affair. These women were kidnapped and put in a room for days, in which they could only see that one soldier. There, they began to develop mixed feelings of hatred, compassion, and even love. Some women volunteered themselves into the arms of the soldiers to ask for the protection of their daughters. That is, they offered themselves as victims before their younger girls were attacked. On some occasions, they did experience moments of genuine and consensual affection and desire, but the nature of these relationships was always mediated by an uneven balance of power. These testimonies show the two faces of the American occupation. They manifest the brutality, but also a great confusion between violent actions, prostitution, and consensual sex. Stigmas, trauma, and after-effects suffered by victims. As it is expected, all these horrible events had enduring consequences in the lives of the victims. In the immediate aftermath of the war, reports started to spread in Berlin, in some cities in eastern Germany, and also in the villages of Upper Bavaria, about women attempting to end their lives after being assaulted. In all cases, the story is similar. They could not bear the stigma of the attack, of being impure. They had been victims of attacks either by the American or the Soviet soldiers. Because of these attacks, they decided to take their own lives. There are countless cases of women who followed through with this decision. They were only culpable of being born women. In most cases, these were young women who could not bear with the social burden of being targeted as prostitutes, as if they had a choice and deliberately sold their bodies to the paying soldiers. But there were also cases of religious women who suffered sexual attacks, and as a result of them were pointed out by their own community and left aside. There were even older women who fell victims of the unbridled sexual appetite of the soldiers. Having nothing else to lose and without understanding why they had been subjected to so much cruelty, they also took the same path. In the German society of the mid-1940s, sexual assault was so shameful that most of the women preferred to keep it in secret. The victims wanted to preserve their families of the stigma, and in some cases went as far as giving birth somewhere else or giving the child to someone else. These procedures were not new. Illegitimate pregnancies before the war were often kept secret in this way too. In some cases in which women became pregnant out of a non-consensual relation, they decided to give birth to the child and raise them themselves. In such cases, the mothers tended to keep silent about how their child had been conceived. They did not want to impose on their heir the cross and the suffering that they had experienced for the rest of their lives. If their secret was out, they would be branded by the rest of their community as traitors and their children as the product of that betrayal. Many children whose identity had been revealed were labeled by other kids and even older adults as Russian brats or black children. The fear of dishonor was quite present in post-war German society. This dishonor often fell on the backs of women much more than on men. Sexual assault in connection with World War II was often interpreted as proof of fraternization with the invader. The accusation of having had sexual contact with occupying soldiers was difficult to avoid, and some victims were often persuaded by their own families not to denounce their assailant. From the beginning of the 20th century, and even more so, after the two wars in which Germany participated, Germany had been a society with more women than men. More than 3 million men answered Adolf Hitler's call to go fight for National Socialism on both the Western and Eastern fronts. Many of them did not return. By 1950, when many men had returned from prisoner of war camps, there were 1,400 women for every 1,000 men in the 25 to 39 age group. When the men of the house and their teenage or young adult children returned from the battlefield, they came back with physical or psychological sequelae that made it impossible for them to return to normal work. Even some who did return relatively healthy found it difficult to return to work because of their political adherence to National Socialism. German families that had enjoyed a certain standard of living in the early years of National Socialism after the economic recovery and had suffered the hardships of the war now suffered the severe shortages of the post-war years. The daily economic hardship resulted in an increase in family violence and also in long separations. The divorce rate continued to rise until the early 1950s. Together with the widows of those who fought on the battlefield and the growing number of single mothers, many of whom had given birth as a result of sexual assault, this resulted in an enormous number of female-headed households. In 1950, after the return of most of the prisoners of war, almost a third of the slightly more than 15 million German households were headed by divorced, widowed, or single women. Brave women, reconstructing their country and families. Arguably, the main tragedy of the German women after World War II has to do with the fact that the reconstruction of the country fell on their backs. After years of suffering food shortages, personal losses, daily insults, and even sexual assaults, these women were expected to keep working and raising healthy children in broken households. Women had been central to Adolf Hitler's plan to create an ideal Aryan community. Praising German women as his most loyal, fanatical fellow combatants, Hitler valued women for both their activism in the Nazi movement and their biological power as generators of the race. In Nazi thinking, a larger, racially purer population would enhance Germany's military strength and provide settlers to colonize conquered territory in Eastern Europe. The Third Reich's aggressive population policy encouraged racially pure women to bear as many children as possible. According to the Nazi Party's propaganda, a woman's place was strictly in the home as mothers and childbearers. It was their husbands who were tasked with working, earning money, and deciding the fates of the country. Now, after the military and political defeat of Nazism in Germany, the role of women in the post-war family continued in ideal terms along the same path. But now, they had to do everything else as well. Domestic work or unpaid labor was still considered a service to the family, the nation, and the country. Women had to give birth to and raise those forges of the capitalist or communist reconstruction of Germany. In the 1950s, the woman-led family became the central nucleus of German reconstruction in all respects. This was enacted both in Western Germany, controlled by France, Britain, and the United States, and in Eastern Germany, the communist side of the country. Trümmerfrauen became a common word in the aftermath of World War II. The word translates literally to rubble women. Their specific job was to clear the rubble of the bombed cities and reconstruct them. It is calculated that 3,600,000 homes were destroyed in 62 German cities due to Allied bombing, making 5 million people homeless. The rubble women had the pharaonic task of picking up and carrying 500 million cubic meters of rubble, which roughly equates to 150 times the volume of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Trümmerfrauen, both volunteers and regular workers, worked in all weather. They were organized in columns of 10 to 20. Their enormous contribution to the reconstruction of Germany is often forgotten, and it is even more remarkable considering the negative conditions in which they were forced to work. In post-war West German politics, conservatives tended to encourage women to have 2 or more children. For their part, the Social Democrats tended to argue in their discourse that male wages should be increased to support women and their families adequately. Neither side questioned the domestic place that women should once again occupy. In the years immediately after the war, the German state had to face policy solutions of financial assistance for the mother-headed families faced with the shortage of men. But once this situation began to change, a single woman's status as a single woman was once again an undesirable situation. Despite all the shortcomings and the sacrifice made in the past decades, the social position of German women changed very little after the war ended. In fact, it could be argued that their position became even worse than before. Although the Nazi desire to increase the birth rate had justified tolerating childbearing outside of marriage, it remained an exception to the rule of legal marriage. The solutions that the defeated countries found to the family problem were more difficult for the defeated nations. Women had to take care of children and adults who were unable to work and often received little help from the state. This latter aspect was a major obstacle for them to return to the normal family model, since many healthy adults preferred to avoid relationships with widows or with women who had already had children. They became unwanted, but at the same time, necessary women for rebuilding and expanding this industrial nation. Another way in which women were stigmatized was the diffusion of venereal diseases. The US government created a cartoon character named Veronika Dankeschön, in an obvious allusion to venereal diseases. Veronika was an unhealthy seductress designed to scare US soldiers into ending sexual relations with German women. As German men returned home, they began to call these women prostitutes. It is believed that the men acted like that in order to express their anger and strife over the knowledge that their women had to sell themselves to survive, while they, the men, were now also dependent on the women. Western women as guardians of the German spirit. The new authorities emphasized women's reproductive work, as it was under Nazism, as essential for the proper functioning of society in all its aspects. But now women also had the responsibility to raise their children with good Christian values. Their mission was to make them resist the temptations of a rising consumer society that advertised the economic miracle of the German recovery, and, at the same time, to educate them in values where work and sacrifice were to remain the flagship of honor. West Germans, despite living under the patronage of the United States, sought to differentiate themselves at least in their values from the Americans who had defeated them. In this mission, women played a fundamental role. They had to inculcate the children with correct values that would allow them not to fall into the temptation of excesses offered by a consumerist society, and the excesses into which the American soldiers had also fallen in occupied lands. Women were to preserve the spirit of German society above materialistic values. Women also needed to watch out for themselves. Those who were obliged to go out to work because they were alone also had to resist this desire to consume unrestrainedly. In this task, the Protestant and Catholic churches were guides for many single women. Despite the differences already noted between conservatives and socialists, there was a broad consensus in West Germany that women and the family should be put back above all in the sphere of private life. The family was that intimate and inviolable place. This was the major contrast in post-war Germany to the Nazis' attempts to make the family a public affair. Once the rubble was lifted and some German men were able to return home, the initial explosion of denunciations of sexual assaults were gradually silenced. In East Germany, the Soviet administration tried to cover up all efforts by German communists who sought to address the issue publicly. They wanted to reverse the image their Russian comrades had left in the lives of German women, many of whom had voted for the German Communist Party in the past. Although silenced, the women were able to express their discontent through democracy. In 1946, in the first open elections in Berlin, the Communist Party lost to the Social Democracy, in part because they had lost the majority of the women's vote. The women, some of which were former communists, did not forget what the Soviet comrades had done to them and their friends or relatives. But even in the West, the issue did not receive the attention it might have received as an instrument of propaganda against the East during the Cold War. With the return of the prisoners of war and the return of women to the home, the subject was put aside in the press and in public discussion. Not because it was too embarrassing for women, but also because it was humiliating for those German men who also had to bear the stigma that their wives had been attacked or had had an affair in their absence. In other words, in the West, the allegations were covered up shamefully. Back on Eastern Germany, the German state under the Soviet orbit proposed to urgently attend to the needs of women and the family, guaranteeing the status of women and supporting them in their domestic work. But also, because of their communist egalitarian values, they proposed the figure of a more independent and dedicated working and professional woman, dedicated to the task of building socialism in Germany. Unlike their Western neighbors, many East German women with conservative values felt forced to leave their homes to work in order to become independent of men, as imposed by the socialist state. Haunted by the American invasion from the West, the Soviets from the East, and years of hardships during the Hitler regime, the post-war situation of German women was a living hell. Mass sexual assaults, sexualization and fetishization, venereal diseases, unwanted pregnancies, rising numbers of abortions, and the stigma and singling out of their own were among their main preoccupations. On top of this burden, the women had to keep their traumatic experiences secret. But even after having been victims of the worst of the war, the capitalist system of the West and the communist system of the East put women back at the center of Germany's reconstruction, whether in their reproductive or educational role, or in their role as workers in the absence of men. These women's sacrifice was the cornerstone of the post-war German miracle.